kept my enemies from looming overhead. Lord, I called you for help, and you sent your very self to save me. Lord, you've brought me up from the grave, and you spared me by showing me your way. Sing to the Lord, all you saints, praise his holy name, his holy name. And sing to the Lord, all you saints, sing to the Lord, praise his name. The rocks even cry out, the mountains will proclaim his name. Oh Lord, I cried for mercy, that you would find no gain in my demise. Even the dust will proclaim, if my lips refuse to trust in God. My salvation comes from Him. He's my rock and my salvation, my fortress never shaken.
How's everyone doing today? Good. Well, I hope for all of our sakes that going to church is like riding a bike, because even though we haven't done it for a while, we're going to jump right back in. And I hope you are ready from the start, because what I say first matters a whole bunch. Some of you are experiencing affliction in your lives, and there is no divine cause behind it. It may be a combination of unintended consequences, oppression from Satan, much like he oppressed Job in the Old Testament, or just bad luck. Of course, that assumes that you believe in luck, but that's a conversation for another time. The main point is that something bad is happening to you, and a careful examination of your life does not indicate that it is the direct result of sin. Now, for years, the Christian church has beat on this drum in response to a previous time in history in which every affliction, every stuffy nose, every broken vase, or every fender bender was the judgment of God visited on his children to teach them discipline and humility. And that is not always true, but sometimes it is. Now, we often think of Joseph in the Old Testament, and many of the Old Testament heroes, as exceptional individuals who were used mightily by God to guide and save the chosen people of Israel during some of their most trying moments. For me personally, this has led to a fairly one-dimensional view of these figures as people set aside by God to do great things. I still believe that. However, as I get older, I am beginning to think that the reason these figures are included in the Bible is not because how God used them socially or how he used them corporately, but rather because of how God interacted with them personally. Our first scripture verse comes from Genesis chapter 37. I got a lot of scriptures this morning. We're going to jump through them as quickly as we can. But we're kind of doing a flyby of Joseph and his life and some of the lessons that I think we can pull from that. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream, and he told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him. Now, I think Joseph gets a pass from a lot of Christians because of where he ends up. But let's not forget that when he was young, he walked around his town bragging about how when he grows up, he is going to be a celebrity, and that his brothers and even his parents were going to bow down to him. I think most Christians attribute his words and his actions to him being naive, or to his brother's jealousy, or even the inability of his father to see God's plan for Joseph's life. But when I put myself into Joseph's sandals, all I see is arrogance. Clearly, Joseph had some insider information. Clearly, he knew he was someone special. But I have a hard time attributing all of what young Joseph says to a genuine desire to share what God had told him with his family. I see someone spoiled by his father and unwilling to humble himself because of what he thought he would become. And for Joseph, the consequences are rather dire. Later on in verse 18, it says, "And they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, these are Joseph's brothers, conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, 'Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams.'" And just like that, Joseph is humbled. Now his brothers don't kill him, but they do instead sell him into slavery. And Joseph went from being the favored son of a relatively small tribe in Canaan to being one of nearly 250,000 slaves in one of the largest established kingdoms in the world at that time, which is Egypt. And I think that Joseph learns a valuable lesson on the journey down to Egypt. He is no longer privileged. He is no longer the favorite. He is a long way from anyone bowing down to him. Later on in Joseph's life, in chapter 39, it says, Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. I believe it is worth noting that Joseph does have some real gifts. He's a shrewd businessman, he is intelligent, he is trustworthy. Everything he touches seems to turn to gold. And maybe I'm projecting too much of myself into Joseph, but I have to believe that there was a time, early one summer morning, when Joseph was drinking his coffee on the deck of his pyramid, looking out over his master's land, and he thought, look at all this. Look at what I have done. None of this would have been possible without me. And Potiphar's wife approached him, and Joseph made the right call. He resisted her advances, and in spite of that, he was framed. Verse 20 says, Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. You see, ladies and gents, growing up, I was taught the story of Joseph, and I was led to believe that God allowed all of this to happen to Joseph as a sort of cosmic chess game, that God was moving kings and bishops around as if the only way that God could get all of the right pieces into all of the right places was if Joseph took a journey as a slave to Egypt with a detour through Potiphar's house into prison, and from there be glorified in front of Pharaoh. But God is God. There's nothing that is impossible with him. And so now when I read Joseph's journey, I'm much less concerned with God moving pieces on a chessboard and much more concerned with God moving the pieces of Joseph's heart. And I think to myself, there must be a reason for all of this. In verse 21 it says, But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. I don't know about you, but I believe for me, prison would definitely be the appropriate place to get right with God. And while the scripture doesn't explicitly state it, as I read the story of Joseph, what I see is a man, like me, who time and time again believes it is by his own strength that he achieves. It is his own cleverness that causes him to succeed. And I think there was a time early on a summer morning, when Joseph was drinking his coffee in his cell, looking out over his prison keeper's ward, and he thought, look at all of this. Look at what I have done. None of this would have been possible without me. And Joseph thought that he had an escape plan all lined up. He thought he had his way out. As part of his duties in prison, he oversees 2 high-ranking officials of Pharaoh, and they both dream particular dreams and ask him to interpret these dreams. Because it doesn't matter what time in history we are, it seems like government officials always find a way into jail. One of the officials says, to one of the officials, Joseph says, tomorrow you will die. And I'm rather sorry about that. And he turns to the other official and he says, tomorrow you will get your job back with Pharaoh. And if you will be so kind as to give him my resume and maybe make a personal recommendation, I would be extremely grateful. And Joseph wakes up the next morning and neither official is there. One of them is killed and one of them is reinstated with the Pharaoh. And Joseph waits, he combs his beard, he puts on his best Sunday jail clothes, and he waits patiently at his cell door and nothing happens. And in chapter 41, verse 1, it says, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed a dream. Verse 9 goes on to say, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. When he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, because his beard after 2 years was no longer combed, and he was no longer wearing his best Sunday jail clothes, he came in before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one here who can interpret it. I have heard it said that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. And here we see, hidden in a conversation between Pharaoh and Joseph, the evidence of a changed heart. It is not in me. Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his own brothers in an act of revenge in order to humble him, still gloried in his own merits. And Joseph, who was framed by his master's wife and falsely accused of rape, still gloried in his own merits. And the same Joseph, who was forgotten as he rotted in prison for a crime he didn't commit, still gloried in his own merits. But 2 years later, the Joseph who stands in front of the most powerful man in the known world can say to that man, it is not in me, but God will give a favorable answer. That is the picture of a heart that has been changed. That is the picture of someone who can echo Jesus on the cross when he prayed, not my will, but your will be done. So I have only one final point, and I will try to make it quickly. As I study the life of Joseph, I am tempted to believe that all the ordeals that Joseph endures are designed by God to create a compassionate and intelligent man who is capable of leading an entire subcontinent through a horrific natural disaster. But I don't think that that is the case. In verse 46 it says, when Joseph was 30 years old, he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and he put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it, and Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. In chapter 42 it says, when Jacob, who's Joseph's father, learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you look at one another? He said, behold, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down, buy grain for us, that we may live and not die, which seemed like a good idea. So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. The temptation for me with the Old Testament is to read it at the kingdom level. And indeed, I think there are lessons for us to learn at the kingdom level. God and the Israelites and the Egyptians and the Amalekites and the Philistines. But Joseph is a man. And for Joseph, I feel his whole life has been in preparation for a test that has not yet come. This week, I encourage you guys to read Genesis chapters 42 through 45 and see the pain that Joseph endures as he wrestles with himself over his encounters with his brothers as they come to petition him for food. Put yourself in his place as the ones who he was closest to growing up, that are now subjected to his good pleasure. There is a saying that goes something like, most people do not behave well because of any moral obligation, but simply because they are cowardly. I know I can be that in a way. I wonder how I would treat my enemies if they were kneeling in front of me, and no one has sold me into slavery. In verse 4, Joseph says to his brothers, come near to me, please. And they came near, And he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me here before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to the Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father, and say to him, Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, and your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. There I will provide for you, for there are yet 5 years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have do not come to poverty. In chapter 45, we see this final confrontation, the final twist, the unveiling, if you will, the season finale. And the tears Joseph weeps as he is reunited with his family, that is the final test. That is the reason for Joseph's lessons in humility. It is not for the saving of nations, although he does save nations. It is for the reconciliation of one man with his brothers. A reconciliation that requires a changed heart that is capable of saying, it is not in me. And as we close, I would encourage you all to consider that what God has called you to may not be as important to history as And as we close, I would encourage you all to consider that what God has called you to may not be as important to history as the way in which He has called you to fulfill His calling in your own lives. If you need more convincing in this area, I would also turn your attention to Jonah. God called Jonah to save nations, and so he did. But the critical test that Joseph passed in his own heart, Jonah failed. The critical challenge that God is calling you to is that which resides in your own heart and in mine.